When it comes to judging a remake of something, there are two ways you can approach it. One way is to play a game of Spot the Difference and judge it by how faithful a recreation it is of the original it's based on, although naturally you need to be familiar with that original in order to do this. The other way you can judge a remake is to look at it as a work in its own right, basically the same way you would look at anything else new. But this comes with the opposite problem, because if you're already familiar with the original, well, there might not be much new there for you to judge at all, and you may catch yourself wondering why they even bothered doing a remake to begin with. And on that note, let's talk about Dead Space. Considered purely as a faithful recreation of the original game from 2008, this remake gets pretty much everything right. The core gameplay is as good as I remember the original being back then, and the changes that have been made are small but generally positive, to the extent where I wouldn't feel uncomfortable saying that this remake more or less makes that original obsolete. To anyone interested in playing Dead Space for the first time, there's really no reason to choose the original over this new one, which I suppose is high praise for a remake, and you could say it's the whole point. If you have played the original, however, then you won't really be playing this remake for the first time, and there's precious little here in the way of new experiences to justify the AAA price tag. To be clear, mechanically speaking, this is a great game competently made, but the thing is, you already played it 15 years ago. The original game still exists, with a borderline identical set of chills, thrills and spills, so what value is this remake providing outside of a fresh coat of paint? Ultimately, my main criticism of this remake is that it has no reason to exist. Or I should say that it has no artistic reason to exist. If a full-priced, big-budget game came out that was identical to this Dead Space remake but named something else, it would rightfully be called derivative and unoriginal. But by slapping an old title on it, EA has license to plagiarize themselves as much as they like and charge full price for it to boot. I mean, why take the risk developing something new when you can just re-release a game that you already know is good? Maybe you think it's unfair of me to criticize Dead Space like this. It's clearly marketed as a remake of an existing game, so how can I complain about getting exactly what I paid for? To answer that, I think we need to get into what the purpose of a remake is in the first place. With the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 for instance, they can at least claim that they exist to modernize the source material and make it more palatable to current tastes. The original games looked and played the way they did because of the hardware limitations of the 90s. As those limitations were removed over time, standards changed, and the third-person twin-stick control scheme became the unquestioned standard for 3D games, which left those old games in an awkward spot behind the curve. Regardless of whether you think this was a good justification for remaking them, you can't argue with the fact that these reinterpretations do make some very drastic changes, and are more like brand new games sharing the same title as the old one. Even at a glance you can see that the remakes offer a very different experience from the originals. Dead Space, birthed from the action horror mold of Resident Evil 4 and already sporting a twin-stick control scheme, was not a game in need of this kind of modernization. The only thing in the remake that feels more current than the original is the time-wasting backtracking you have to do for the new side missions, and doesn't that just tell you everything you need to know about modern game design? I'll let you stew on that and return later to my thoughts on the nature of remakes, but now I think it's time to get into the specifics of Dead Space, what makes it good, because it is good, and what makes it disappointing. Spoilers from here. In Dead Space you play as Isaac Clarke, an engineer 500 years in the future sent to investigate the radio silence of the Ishimura, a planet-cracking ship mining for resources above the distant exoplanet of Aegis 7. Not long after boarding the Ishimura, the shit hits the fan, and Isaac and the repair team are attacked and separated by the mutated corpses of the ship's former crew. Chapter by chapter, chasing one MacGuffin or another, Isaac moves around the whole ship repairing broken engines, comms arrays and asteroid defense systems, while slaughtering and otherwise dismembering the reanimated necromorphs that stand in his way. As far as settings for an action horror game go, it's a pretty original one with some intriguing lore tidbits scattered around, although I'm a sucker for dark sci-fi like this. The real meat of the game though is the combat you get into against the necromorph enemies, so we might as well dive straight in there. The combat of Dead Space is based around dismemberment. Since your enemies are already mutated and reanimated corpses, they can't really be killed, only stopped.
Does that even kill them? Or do they just stop moving?
To take out these necromorphs then, you need to sever their limbs, a fact the game takes great pains to drill into your head in multiple ways at the beginning like it thinks you're stupid. The first weapon you pick up is a plasma cutter, actually a tool rather than a weapon, but no less effective at slicing alien appendages. It has a line-shaped beam that can be rotated either vertically or horizontally, which makes its use for cutting pretty intuitive, and the first necromorph you face will quickly get you accustomed to the concept that you'll spend the next 12 hours playing with. At its core, the combat in Dead Space is about making quick decisions and precise shots to take down each group of enemies as safely and efficiently as possible. Generally speaking, the obvious tactic for most enemies is to remove their legs first to restrict their mobility, then finish them by taking off an arm or two, though there's a healthy amount of enemy variety throughout the game that frequently forces you to adapt this strategy. There's a fair amount of variety on the player's side too, as the game doesn't wait long before giving you new weapons and abilities, though I'll argue shortly that most aren't worth bothering with. First is the stasis module, which slows time in an area of effect and is occasionally used to solve environmental puzzles, though it needs to be replenished by a consumable or a refill console. In combat, stasis is pretty much a get out of jail free card, as it will instantly make nearby enemies harmless and let you get some free shots on them, which can lead to insanely powerful synergies with certain other weapons. This is mostly balanced out by the fact that stasis energy is a limited resource, which forces you to consider carefully when you use it, but if you're near one of these infinite dispensers, then you might as well go wild with it. Also acquired early on is the kinesis module, which lets you pick up and throw stuff like explosive canisters or instant kill metal poles that pin enemies to the wall. Since they cause a free instant kill without costing you any kind of resource, these poles are high value items that you might even want to carry around between rooms, as cumbersome as that may be. As for the actual weapons you can pick up throughout the game, there's a good handful with different properties, but nothing really beats the simplicity and efficiency of the ordinary plasma cutter, and I finished my first playthrough using only that starting weapon. As I said, combat in Dead Space is all about making precise shots, and no other weapon does this better. The second one you pick up, the plasma rifle, is such a stark demonstration of this that I think it must be deliberate. The rapid fire of this rifle is useless for accurately targeting the limbs of monsters, and its only saving grace is the proximity mine's secondary fire, which I ended up using just like a grenade launcher anyway. This plasma rifle is the weapon that most security personnel on the Ishimura were equipped with, and it's actually kind of clever that you experience firsthand how worthless it is against a necromorph infestation. You also get a flamethrower, a laser, and a few other heavy-hitting weapons, but they tend to lack the precision needed to actually engage with the dismemberment mechanics, so even on my second playthrough they didn't get much use. The one exception here is the Ripper, which extends a spinning saw blade that can absolutely annihilate enemies that have been frozen by stasis. Even this mini-boss can be taken down with a single saw blade after being frozen, and this is on the hardest difficulty. And speaking of which, I think it's fair to say that Dead Space is not a difficult game, and resource management will rarely be a concern throughout a playthrough. While being economical with instant kill traps and stasis dispensers certainly saved me some ammo that I would have otherwise used, I don't really feel like my ingenuity was rewarded because even on higher difficulties there's no reason to be conservative with ammo to begin with. The Ishimura is littered with side rooms and storage lockers that contain ammo, credits and other consumables, and enemies will also drop ammo for whichever weapons you happen to be using. This is a contrivance that's all too easy to exploit, and many if not most encounters can end with you having more resources than when you started, which doesn't feel quite right to me. Add to this the fact that your weapons will get more powerful as you upgrade them, and Dead Space is a game that gets easier over time, not harder, at least in terms of the resource mechanics. At the end of my first playthrough I was carrying literally hundreds of charges for the plasma cutter, so much that I no longer had to be efficient or precise with my shots. Now, all that probably doesn't sound great, does it? The first weapon you get is by far the most useful, and most of the others don't even harmonise well with the game's main combat mechanic. On top of that, the fact that you can upgrade weapons by investing resources into them means that you're even more likely to stick with one or two throughout the whole game to get them as powerful as possible, which will also trick the ammo drop system into giving you more for the guns you like. Fortunately, when you're actually playing Dead Space, it feels like none of this matters at all, because the variety on the enemy side of things more than picks up the slack, and the complexity here keeps the game interesting through multiple playthroughs. After the ordinary necromorphs encountered at the beginning, the second type you'll meet is this legless leaping one, whose beefy arms take an unsettling number of shots to sever, and their unpredictability meant that I never quite felt safe fighting them. The baby necromorphs spit ranged attacks from these tentacle things, and you'll need to wait until they extend them in order to do any effective damage. The flying stingray necromorphs can infect corpses and turn them into enemies, so it's usually a good idea to prioritize taking them out. There are bulging necromorphs with bellies full of swarmers that you need to take care not to rupture, or you'll be rushed by their stomach contents. Some unfortunate souls are fused to the wall and spit out little sentries, and need to have all of their tentacles severed to get rid of them, or you can just blow them up. There's a regenerating enemy that chases you throughout the game, and usually appears alongside other enemies, meaning that you need to stall him while dealing with other threats. On the mining deck you encounter necromorphs whose bottom half is still covered in protective gear, which means your usual tactic of aiming for the legs won't work. There are necromorphs with swollen, explosive growths that you can cut off to use against others or just blow up for an easy kill. These spindly tall guys will break apart when killed, and their individual parts will come to life and try to strangle you. In the second half, when a military ship arrives, the soldiers turned necromorphs have had their stasis modules fuse into their bodies, and they move with an extra panic-causing speed. And finally, there's a huge recurring mini-boss who obviously commands immediate attention when he's in the room. As you can see, there's a seriously impressive amount of variety here, and the different strategies necessary for dispatching each enemy means that the game gets a hell of a lot of mileage out of throwing them at you in different combinations. Individually, each enemy type doesn't present much of a challenge. Once you've realised the most efficient strategy for taking out each one, there's not a lot of tension in executing it as long as you keep your cool, which is why the most memorable combat encounters are specifically designed to make you lose your cool and panic about which enemies you should be prioritising. When you have an exploder lumbering towards you on one side and a big-bellied swarmer charging on the other, you need to do some quick decision making, and a single misplaced shot could be the difference between making it through and getting overwhelmed. It's surely no accident that scenes like this are the ones that stuck in my head as highlights of the game's combat. You'll learn early on that the way to succeed in combat is to quickly take control of the situation and avoid panicking, and with that in mind, you'll be proceeding slowly and carefully through each area so as not to get surprised and overwhelmed. This works really well, and even when you're certain you're about to encounter an enemy group, there's still a lot of tension, and you'll be on edge waiting for them to appear so that you can get to work dispatching them. The environments too are varied enough that you're usually not doing the same thing for long. Tight corridors are usually used to introduce you to new enemies or concepts, before eventually spitting you out into a wider arena that will test you on what you've learned. These open arenas are where the combat really shines and can get your heart pumping. When you have necromorphs coming towards you from multiple directions, you need to think quickly about how to safely take them out while using as few resources as possible. Again, the combat demands precision while under high pressure. When I entered one of these arenas and it was obvious that a bunch of enemies were going to join me after a certain trigger, I would grab all the instant kill traps I could reach and put them together in a central spot for ease of use, which is an ammo saving trick that's sadly never truly necessary. In terms of other environments, there's the occasional scene where you're placed on rails and have to defend yourself from ranged enemies at your sides. There are certain rooms with hazards and death traps that have to be avoided, and sometimes you'll find yourself in a vacuum and under a strict oxygen time limit, which gives you yet another thing you need to keep track of while in combat. There's even one room with a nuclear warhead that needs to be disarmed, and you need to avoid blowing up the explosive enemies in the room to prevent a chain reaction. It's a unique scenario that forces you to reverse your instincts when it comes to these exploding guys, and I would have liked to see more of this kind of thing. The stars of Dead Space's environmental carousel, though, are the zero-gravity sections. And it's also here that I can finally bring up a difference between this remake and the original, because the remake gives you full control over Isaac in zero-G, and lets you float around however you like, whereas in the original his feet always had to be planted on the ground, and you were restricted to just jumping across the room. The freedom of movement added to these zero-G sequences feels so natural that it's almost hard to believe how much more restrictive the original was in comparison, and this is one of those little tweaks that makes this remake an improvement over its predecessor. Do I think this minor improvement justifies the AAA price tag? No, but it is a positive change that's worthy of praise. Because there will always be those who complain about changes in remakes, I can imagine some purists saying that the original was better because the restrictive controls meant you were in more danger and had to be more aware of your surroundings in zero-G. Even if there's some truth to this, Dead Space is an action game at heart, and I think the freer control scheme was the right call. A lot of the game's environmental hazards appear in zero-G areas, and the solution to almost every single one of them is to freeze the hazard with stasis and float past it, which does get a little old by the end. Since you'll be floating around at your leisure in these zero-G sequences, only ranged enemies could pose a threat to you, and sure enough it's only the jumping guys and the tentacle babies that the game throws at you in these moments, which can also get repetitive considering how much the combat usually relies on variety to keep things interesting. So while I'm on the subject, let's get into a few of the other additions that are new to the remake. One feature that I really like is these fuse box things, where you need to choose which fuses to activate with limited power. After being introduced to the concept with a basic example where you can only open one door at a time, the next occasion you run into one of these is much more interesting. There are 3 fuses, one for the door you want to get through, one for the lift that will take you to that door, and one for the lighting in the room, but only 2 fuses can be active at once. When it hits you that you need to switch off the lights in the room in order to get that door open and reach it, it's a brilliant moment of realization, and one that will fill you with dread at this early stage in the game. They could have just had the lights go out by themselves when you reach this spot, but asking you to switch them off by yourself is so much more interesting and makes the player into more of an active participant in the horror. It's an inspired decision that's worthy of praise, although I think it's a bit of a cop-out that the emergency lights come on, because it would have been so much scarier to be completely in the dark. A similar moment later on is even better, when you need to choose between either turning off the lights or turning off the oxygen, a decision that's sure to have you agonizing over it on a first playthrough. I would have liked to see more of this mechanic, but unfortunately these are the only interesting uses of it throughout the game, except for an admittedly pretty funny joke in the hydroponics lab. You better believe I'm leaving the jungle ambience switched on. There are also some minor additions to the story, like fleshing out Isaac's relationship with certain other characters, and while these inclusions are positive and make the story more believable, they're really of secondary concern to me after the actual game that I paid to play. The other new addition to the remake that's actually worth mentioning is the presence of side missions, made possible by the fact that the Ishimura is now a semi-open world that lets you revisit old areas as you please via the tram system, but I'm not so sure the game actually gains anything from this more open structure besides an inflated runtime. When a side mission took me back to an area I'd already explored, it just had me sprinting from map marker to map marker, often without even having to deal with enemies. In the cases where there were enemies, I already knew the area's layout and could easily run past them. This is in stark contrast to the way I played on my first pass through each area, where I'd usually be taken in by the tense atmosphere and inch forward slowly and carefully. So not only does the backtracking add nothing to the experience, it can actually make that experience worse because sprinting through a horror game is a quick way to forget that you're supposed to be scared. Without a doubt, the greatest strength of Dead Space is in its variety, which is probably another reason why the backtracking side missions feel like such a waste of time. It's a real credit to the design that I can remember the setting and the highlights from every chapter, and the game continues its obsession with providing variety even to the very end, as the final chapter sees you escorting the artifact responsible for the necromorph outbreak across the colony on the planet's surface. When enemies are close to it, they get this red outline and become more powerful, so you need to think more about positioning than you did in earlier chapters, although this late in the game your weapons will probably be overpowered enough to just ignore it. So on the topic of variety, I might as well wrap up by talking about the unique gameplay set pieces of Dead Space, which occur every couple of chapters or so to keep you on your toes and provide yet more diversity to the experience. In the first half, there's a short asteroid defense section on the exterior of the ship that sees you calibrating turrets by pointing at targets yourself, another small improvement over the stationary turret used to do this in the original. This is a great tweak that retains the change of pace without slowing things to a crawl. As much as I love pointing and clicking on things, I think we can all agree that mounted turret sections are a feature best left in games of the 2000s. Also of note are the tentacle jump scares, where Isaac is grabbed and you need to cut off the leg snatcher before it can drag you back to its hole. These play out identically to the original game in mechanics, in location, and even, as far as I can tell, in animation. As a loving homage to the first tentacle scene from the original, this remake offers a flawless recreation, but while this shocked and amazed me back in 2008, it didn't exactly blow me away today. Unfortunately, here's where my praise for the remake starts to run dry, and I start questioning the point of it all, because as someone who experienced the original and was expecting this set piece, I couldn't help but feel underwhelmed when it played out exactly the same way. This is the moment that got me thinking that this remake is faithful to a fault. Clearly the intended effect of this scene is to surprise the player, first with a jump scare, and then with a unique mechanic they need to quickly get to grips with under pressure. The devs of the remake knew that anyone who's played the original game has already been through this exact experience once already, and therefore wouldn't be surprised by it a second time. And yet, here it is again, in identical form to all those years ago, one of the most memorable moments of the original game reduced to a forgettable copy and paste. Just think of how differently this could have gone, how much the remake could have won up to the original here with the benefit of 15 years of hindsight. This seems like such an obvious spot for a fake out or a twist or literally anything to surprise returning players, and as you can tell I'm pretty salty about the fact that they didn't do it. Again, I find myself asking, what's the point of remaking a game like this if you're not going to try and improve on every element? When you're paying full price for a AAA game, how much of that price entitles you to expect some new experiences you haven't had before? The tiny incremental updates that are present in this remake are nowhere near enough to legitimize it as a fully priced release. Maybe I'm just cynical, but when a remake is offering almost exactly the same experience I already had over a decade ago, I think I'm justified in saying that the developer's time would have been better spent working on something new instead. Let's put that to one side for now and finish looking at the game's set pieces. The first battle against the Leviathan at the game's halfway point is serviceable enough and makes use of a few of your abilities, but it shares the same weakness as fights against single enemies. That is, it's easy to the point of being uninteresting. You move out of the way of a basic attack and shoot at the weak point, then throw the boss's explosive balls back at him. I was already bored of this boss fight before it was over, which is obviously not something you want your players to feel at any point in the game, but what's worse is that the final boss suffers from exactly the same issue. Before I get into that, let's take a quick look at the second fight with the Leviathan, which I think is the closest a boss fight comes in this game to being, good. It sees the return of the asteroid cannons from earlier, and bringing back this mechanic is a nice way of making the fight feel unique. Dodging the boss's attacks isn't any more complicated than it was the last time around, but this time you don't have to wait for it to reveal a weak spot before you can attack, so you can multitask and have control over the pace of the fight in a way that's far more satisfying to play. More elements are slowly added as the fight progresses, like having to switch to a different cannon, the boss throwing its explosive projectiles at you, these biological landmines which get ejected for the final phase, and the final cannon which gets destroyed and leaves you to finish off the boss with kinesis. On top of that, you have to do it all while under an oxygen time limit, so there's plenty of factors you have to keep track of at once. Let's compare that to the Hive Mind, the final boss on the surface of Aegis 7, which goes back to the old classic formula of making you wait through a series of painfully slow and easy to dodge attacks before asking you to shoot its nipples off one by one. It's capped off with one of these semi-QTEs like the tentacles that grab you earlier on, and once you get a few hits on its glowing weak spot, you're done. I distinctly remember having my teenage mind blown by this final boss back in 2008, but when I reached the end of the remake and put down the controller, I was just left thinking, was that it? And honestly, that pretty much sums up my thoughts on the remake as a whole. I feel I should repeat again that this is a very good game, and I enjoyed revisiting Dead Space, but the reason it's a good game now is because it was already a good game 15 years ago. I couldn't help but feel disappointed that there was nothing really new to see here, and that led me to two realizations. Firstly, that the original back in 2008 got a shocking amount right on its first try, and the combat mechanics at the core of Dead Space still feel remarkably fresh. But that leads me to my second thought, that maybe we actually haven't come very far in the intervening 15 years. That may not sound like such a long time, but when you consider that it's almost a third of the entire time computer games have existed, it looks a little more significant. The Resident Evil remakes can attempt to justify their existence by doing things that were technically impossible back when the originals were released, and in fact they might be more accurately called reimaginings than remakes. But the kind of technological leap that made those originals look old in the first place will probably never happen again. Back in the day, the original Dead Space was impressive and innovative for a similar reason. It used the newest console hardware to provide an experience that wouldn't have been possible a generation earlier. In the absence of anything new that fundamentally changes how the game is played, this remake has very little to offer anyone who's already played that original. You might disagree with me on this, and judging from the Steam reviews it seems that I might be in the minority here, but it feels like we've all been tricked into buying the same thing we bought 15 years ago, and I can just picture the emboldened EA executives laughing all the way to the bank as they greenlight remakes of every decade-old game they still hold the rights for. Despite the high quality of Dead Space, I was still left disappointed by the end, and I can't shake the feeling that I'll be going through a lot of similar experiences in the years to come. But hey, at least it's better than the Callisto Protocol.